So let's talk about attachment and attachment styles. And this will offer you the opportunity to answer some important questions for yourself, such as, what is my, meaning your, attachment style in relationship? One of the most robust findings in the field of psychology is this notion of attachment styles. And this was something that was discovered through a beautiful set of studies that were done by Mary Ainsworth in the 1980s, in which she developed a laboratory condition called the strange situation task. Now, the strange situation task has been studied over and over again in different cultures, in different locations throughout the world. And in preparing for this episode, I actually spoke to 3 different psychologists. I spoke to a psychoanalyst, I spoke to a cognitive behavioral psychologist, and I actually spoke to a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, but a psychiatrist with a medical degree, and asked, is the strange situation task and the various attachment styles that emerge from that task, are those still considered valid? And indeed, all 3 of them said, if ever there was a literature in psychology that is absolutely tamped down and has a firm basis in both data and real-world principles and real-world examples, it's this notion of attachment styles. So what is the strange situation task? The strange situation task involves a parent, typically a mother in the studies that were done, but a parent or other caregiver bringing their child, their actual child, into a laboratory, and there's a room with a stranger. And the mother enters the room with the child, and there's some toys in the room, and typically the mother and the stranger will talk. Obviously, the stranger is part of the experiment. It's not just some random person off the street. And the child is allowed to move about the room. They can observe the mother interacting with the other person or not. They can play with toys or not. But then at some point, the mother leaves. And then at some point later, designated by the experimenter, the mother comes back. And what is measured in these studies is both how the child, the toddler, reacts to the mother leaving and how the child reacts to the mother returning at the end of the experiment. And oftentimes this will have 2 or 3 different phases where the mother will bring the child in, then leave, then come back in and leave. There are also studies in which the behavior of the child with the stranger is also examined. So there are a lot of variations of this, but the basic findings are that toddlers, children, fall into 4 different categories of attachment style, and that these attachment styles can predict many features of adolescent, teen, young adult, and even adult attachment styles, not in strange situations of the sort that I just described, but in romantic attachments. I should mention also that attachment style is plastic, meaning it can change across the lifespan. So as I described the results, I described the different attachment styles that are out there. And if any of those resonate with you or bring to mind certain people in your life, please do not assume that those attachment styles are rigid and fixed for the entire lifespan. There are also terrific data that indicate that through specific processes, both psychological and some biological adjustments, that people can change their attachment style, and that indeed people who have different attachment styles can change the attachment styles of others. But just to make very clear what the results of the study were, I want to review what the 4 different attachment styles are, and typically people fall into one group or another, but not several. So the 4 patterns of attachment that were revealed by these studies, again, were revealed by examining the behavior of the child in response to the mother leaving and the mother returning, and the child's response to the stranger that is in the room with them. The first style is the so-called secure attachment style. In the nomenclature of this kind of study, these are the so-called B babies, as in the letter B, bulldog, B. Not for bulldogs, but just to designate this category. The secure attachment style is one in which the child will engage with the stranger, with the experimenter, while the parent is present in the room, but that when the parent, typically it's a mother, but when the parent or other caregiver leaves, the child does get visibly upset. They might whine, they might cry, they might even tantrum a bit. However, when the caregiver, meaning the mother or father or other caregiver, returns, the child visibly expresses happiness that the caregiver has returned. Okay, so that's the hallmark of the secure attachment style. And again, this is all pre-verbal. This is happening long before the child can express how they feel with words. And the interpretation of this is that the secure child feels confident that the caregiver is available and will be responsive to their needs and their communications, so that when the child whines and or is distressed, the parent doesn't come right back into the room, but at some point they do, and they seem to have a sense of trust that if the parent or caregiver leaves, that the parent will come back, and that they're happy that they do. These children are also very good at exploring novel environments after the parent is gone and while the parent is there. And almost always when the parent is there, they will explore more broadly, literally in space. They'll venture out further than they will when the parent is gone. They also tend to engage with the caregiver in a way that's not immediately and completely trusting, but that over time seems to evolve from one in which they're kind of suspicious of this person to one in which they're at least somewhat trusting. Okay, so those are the general contours of the secure attachment style. And fortunately, nowadays there are physiological studies measuring things like heart rate and breathing and other measures that correlate with the subjective assessment of what these children are feeling. Okay, so first category is secure attached. The second category is the so-called anxious avoidant or insecurely attached, which are the category A babies. The children with anxious avoidant insecure attachment patterns generally tend to avoid or ignore the caregiver, all right, meaning the parent, and show very little emotion when the parent leaves or returns. So this is the reason they call them avoidant or anxious avoidant and kind of insecure. There isn't this happiness or joy that the parent is back. They don't seem to express that. They do not exhibit distress on separation, and they generally tend to have some tendency to approach the caregiver when they return, but there doesn't seem to be a general expression of joy. And again, physiological measures support that as well. Things like changes in heart rate tend to be less dramatic in the anxious avoidant insecure attachment style than in the secure attachment style. Okay, so that's the second one. The third category is the so-called anxious ambivalent / resistant insecure category. Okay, I didn't name these categories, so you have to blame others in this one instance. For everything else, blame me. But in this instance, you have to blame the psychologists that named this category. The anxious ambivalent / resistant insecure category, also called the C babies, for the letter C, just as a categorization. The anxious ambivalent resistant insecure toddlers really show distress even before separation from their mother or other caregiver. And they tend to be very clingy and difficult to comfort when the caregiver returns. Okay, so they're distressed even before the mother leaves the room, and they tend to be very clingy and really hard to calm down when the mother returns. They tend to show either what seems to be resentment in response to the parent's absence. We don't really know what they're feeling, or some sort of helpless passivity. And there's actually subcategorizations that the psychologists have come up with C1 subtypes and C2 subtypes. We don't have to get bogged down in that. But just know that there isn't one absolute measure that says, oh, well, this person is anxious, ambivalent, resistant, insecure. They could be somewhat passive, or they could be seem somewhat angry at the caregiver. But the basic idea is that before and after the separation, they are clingy and difficult to comfort. They just can't seem to calm themselves down. And physiological measures of heart rate and hormone measurements, such as cortisol, also support that statement. And the third category of attachment style is the so-called disorganized or disoriented, or D for the letter D babies. This is a categorization that was added later to this strange situation task that is a real hallmark of developmental psychology studies. It was developed by Mary Ainsworth graduate student, Mary Main, who I actually had the great fortune of taking a course from and learning from when I was a graduate student at Berkeley many years ago. And this fourth categorization was controversial for a while, but now is generally accepted. The key feature of the disorganized, disoriented category is that the toddlers tend to be tense, and they tend to encompass a lot of kind of odd physical postures. They tend to hunch their shoulders. They'll put their hands behind their neck. They'll cock their head to the side. For those of you listening, I'm doing this on the video version. It's not where you don't have to go see that. But for those of you that are watching this on video, they tend to kind of constrain their body size a bit and go into odd postures that they normally wouldn't do anywhere else. So this is why it's called the disorganized or disoriented category. It seems like these children just don't really know how to react to a separation. And they just start to manifest behaviors and emotional tones that aren't observed in other situations. Okay, so we've got our 4 categories. I'll try and use the shortest possible names for each category. We've got category 1, which is securely attached. We've got category 2, which is insecurely attached, also sometimes called anxious avoidant. Then we've got category 3, which is the resistant insecure category, which is anxious ambivalent. And then there's this 4th category, the disorganized disoriented category, or the so-called D babies.